Right, so ancient China. Talk about the earliest Chinese dynasties and what that concept means. The very idea of the Chinese dynasty and why that's important. We talk about the terracotta army there and the great emperor Qin Shi Huangdi. But first things first, geography as always. So we've already been here in Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent. I don't know why it's jumpy like that. Shaky. It's weird. Anyway, we've been to Egypt here. We've been to India here, the Indus and Ganges River valleys. Now we'll move over here. These are riverine civilizations over here as well. Some of us call it in the West, the Yellow River, the Huanghe River, and the Yangtze River further south, settled later. So these two river valleys are the heart of ancient Chinese civilization. The Yellow and Yangtze River valleys. Along with that, other natural barriers. This has been a theme. We saw this with India. We saw this with Egypt. Of course, the Yellow Sea, the Pacific Ocean, the South China Sea. To the east, over here to the west, the Tibetan Plateau. Here, you know about the Himalayan mountains, the Karakoram Mountains, the Hindu Kush. Up here, above the Kunlun Shan Mountains, the Taklamakan Desert. More mountains here, and the Gobi Desert here. This area is known as Manchuria, not part of China proper, but eventually will be part of a later and greater Chinese empire. Really the only open avenues into China are down here in the south towards Indochina, or where Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia are, and up here passes through the mountains to the north, or here between the Gobi Desert and Manchuria, which is of course where some of the Chinese dynasties will at times build parts of or contribute to the so-called Great Wall. But, oh man, I can't Google Earth. What a sad day. This is so limiting. My powers have been stripped. I would give us the overhead satellite view, and you would see how barren it was over here with the two deserts and the great vast flat Tibetan plateau. Which, by the way, the mouths of the Indus River, the Ganges River, the Mekong River, which flows down into Indochina and lets out in southeastern Vietnam, all of those headwaters are in the Tibetan Plateau. It's crazy. But in any case, you could see, this is sort of the historical ancient heart of China over here in the east. The great capital of some of the earlier Chinese dynasties is here at Xi'an. That's where the terracotta warriors are that we'll talk about. Modern day capital here is at Beijing, but this wasn't added to China, all of this out here, until much later. And traditionally, the other thing I guess to point out is that the great invaders of China, first the Xiongnu, and later, of course, the Mongols come from up here in the north, despite the presence there of the Great Wall. So in mythical Chinese history, the first dynasty is the Xia, Xia dynasty, but we have no archaeological evidence of the actual existence of that dynasty. So again, it is assumed to just be mythical. The first Chinese dynasty that we actually have some proof of its existence would be the Shang dynasty, circa 1600 to 1046 BCE. What about the concept, though, of dynasty? What does dynasty mean? It means a hereditary line of rulers, of emperors and elites surrounding them and associated with them. So somewhat like a ruling house in European history, if you're talking about English or French history or whatever. But China is so vast and China is multi-ethnic, so it would be more like if a ruling house from one of those kingdoms or countries ruled over the entirety of the European continent. And indeed, sometimes in more modern Chinese history, the dynasty can be outsiders. It can be outside invaders who come in and take over as the hereditary ruling elite of China and adopt many of China's traditions and institutions, where they typically have held up even when the dynasties themselves or the governments of China do not. In terms of the Shang dynasty, the first civilization to emerge during the transition from the Neolithic or New Stone Age period to the Bronze Age. We know they had copper and tin tools, but they were still obviously a largely agricultural people, growing wheat in the Yellow River Valley to the north and millet. Millet is a type of grass that has these edible white seeds. It's easy to grow, easy to cultivate, nourishing. And later in the Yangtze River Valley to the south, that proves more appropriate for the growing of rice, which tends to feed more people, lead to a higher population. We know these people had bronze tools, utensils, and weapons. They had pretty sophisticated vessels for use in ancestral rites. These are considered to be the pinnacle of ancient Chinese art. I think I have images of a couple of these. Yeah. Shang Dynasty era vessels. We know they had 2-horse chariots and a very large army and an elaborate bureaucracy. They developed a sophisticated system of writing that, in terms of the fundamentals, is still in use today, which makes this the oldest continually used writing system in the world. Becomes the basis of Chinese pictograms, which then become logograms. Logograms would be symbols corresponding to words, which are subsequently borrowed in some form by other East Asian languages, including Korean and Japanese. One of the things that allow us to know what we know about this ancient Chinese civilization is these oracle bones that have survived. Pieces of ox or cattle bone or turtle shell that have inscriptions on them. They would heat these up, and a priest would fracture these with a rod and then sort of try to decipher what they could or thought they could from the way that the oracle bones fractured. This is their way of communicating with the gods in their polytheistic religion, to ask the gods about upcoming harvests or upcoming military campaigns, or what the weather was going to be for the upcoming season. And these priests would engage in divination, that is, trying to interpret from these oracle bones and the way that they fractured what the gods were trying to tell them. The pattern of the cracks in these oracle bones after they had fractured. And there are inscriptions on these, and we have deciphered their system of writing. It's, as I said, it has gone through the ages and still in use, so we're able to read what is on the inscriptions, and we can tell what was on the minds of the Shang rulers. which at times were their campaigns, military campaigns to the west against a rival people who ultimately will displace them. And that is the Zhou dynasty. 1045 BC to 221. The ruler of the province of Zhou overthrows the Shang dynasty and establishes his own and moves the capital west to closer to where their homelands were, to where I pointed out earlier, Xi'an. They maintained the Shang dynasty's government structure with a large bureaucracy and officials in charge of law and education and public works. The organization of the empire into provinces that had hereditary aristocratic governors who rulers of these provinces owed tribute and service to the emperor. But they get the same in turn from vassals within their province, making this a sort of feudalistic system. But ultimately, the Zhou will expand China's borders to 4 times that of what they have been under the Shang. And they will introduce to China an institution, a concept, which would remain at the heart of any Chinese dynasty, no matter how many times it sort of changes hands, for thousands of years. That is the mandate of heaven. The Zhou wanted to convince the people that the Shang had lost the legitimacy to rule and that they were indeed the rightful rulers of the Chinese kingdom. So this concept of the mandate of heaven centers around the idea of Tian. And heaven here is an imperfect translation, because it doesn't mean, like in Christianity, simply like a destination in the afterlife, or a paradise for the soul in the afterlife. It means something more akin to like the heavens and the cosmos and all the world, and like an all-powerful force. It's a little bit similar to the concept of Brahman, or the great soul in Brahmanism or Hinduism that we talked about last time. All-powerful force of the universe. And if a dynasty possessed the mandate of heaven, they had the blessing of that all-powerful universal force of Tian to rule. That means that makes them the rightful rulers of China. If you possess the mandate of heaven, you have the right and the legitimacy to rule over the Chinese people. But there's a but to it. It sounds a little bit like, if you know your European history, the divine right, the idea of the divine right of kings. God gives legitimacy to the king or queen to rule. But it's different than that. Because it comes with obligations. And it could be lost. If dynastic rulers did not rule benevolently, if they didn't rule with justice and morality, they could lose the mandate of heaven, and so it went. And this is the argument that the Zhou rulers make about the Shang rulers, that they had not ruled in the way that they should, had lost the mandate of heaven, and that the Zhou dynasty had picked it up, or been blessed with it, if you will. And it was said, if you didn't rule with justice and morality and rule benevolently, there would be signs that a dynasty was losing the mandate of heaven. If there was, say, a famine among the people, dynasty's not doing what it's supposed to do. If there were outside invasions, from the north or the south that were threatening Chinese sovereignty, well, God must be losing the mandate of heaven. Sometimes if there were natural disasters like earthquakes or floods, this could be taken as a sign that the dynasty was losing the mandate of heaven. And someone else then might come in and take it up. And this happens over and over again, even as we'll see later in the semester. When outsiders like the Mongols come in and invade China and take it over, they adopt this institution and claim to have taken up the mandate of heaven themselves and proclaim themselves to be a new dynasty. So powerful is this institution in the minds of the Chinese people. Does that make sense? In terms of economy and society, it's, as I said earlier, similar to European feudal society in that the land, for the most part, is owned by hereditary lords, but worked primarily by peasants. Using the well field system, whereby peasants worked strips of land for themselves on the Lord's land, but they all also contributed and worked collectively on a portion of the land on behalf of the Lord. So in European history, this would be the idea of the Lord's domain, where all the peasants also contribute to cultivating a portion of the land for the Lord himself. There were walled towns controlled by these lords as well, which housed a number of merchants and artisans. Technological advances under the Zhou dynasty would include the advent of the iron plow, which you know about its importance from our discussion of India before. Also, large-scale irrigation projects, which we've seen elsewhere. Canals, as we saw in Mesopotamia, to divert water for agriculture. Other agricultural advancements like developing fertilizers and understanding that it is occasionally beneficial to allow fields to lie fallow, that is, to not grow anything in a field for a season in order to allow it to replenish nutrients, so fallow fields. These and other advancements allow the population in China to increase under the Zhou dynasty to perhaps 20 million people. And we know that they were very active in trade with peoples to the south and to the west, exporting things like jade and then most famously of all, silk, for the system of trade routes between China and the west come to be known as the Silk Road. As seen here, there is not one single road, but it is known as the Silk Road, connecting China to or through Central Asia and Southwest Asia, and by proxy then Europe. Silk Road routes run from Xi'an and places farther to the east through the Tianshan Mountains, the Kunlunshan Mountains, the edges of at least the Taklamakan Desert, across the mountains and into Central Asia, through major cities of Central Asia that we'll talk about, like Samarkand, through the northern reaches of Persia and into Mesopotamia. The dynastic cycle in China here, this is useful. Although this projector is either shitty or needs to be adjusted. Because not only is it jumpy, but it's also fuzzy. Poor people in the other cohort probably can't even see. You guys are probably going to have to follow along with your own PowerPoint from your own device. And I'm going to have to read this from over here on the laptop. And perhaps that has something to do with it, I don't know. So, top center. Strong dynasty establishes peace and prosperity. It is considered to have the mandate of heaven. To the right. In time, dynasty declines and becomes corrupt. Taxes are raised. Power grows weaker and down. Disasters such as floods, famines, peasant revolts, and invasions occur. Old dynasty is seen as having lost the mandate of heaven. Rebellion is now justified. Dynasty is overthrown through rebellion and bloodshed, and new dynasty emerges new dynasty gains power, restores peace and order, and claims to have the mandate of heaven. And it happens over and over and over again. And we'll work our way through a handful of these dynasties before this semester is done. We're going to come back to China at least 2 more times after this lecture. So under the Zhou dynasty, 2 very important schools of thought emerge, and they both remain very influential, perhaps, and you could make a case to this very day. Under the communist government of China today, I think you could argue that both of these schools of thought influence the way that government rules. And the first is Confucianism. Confucius, who was born 551 BCE, is a philosopher who builds upon the ancient ideas of Qian, or heaven, and yang and yin, or good and evil, and developed a practical philosophy of ethics and politics that is recorded by his followers, written down by his followers. It's not an institutional religion. Again, it's more of a practical philosophy, as I said, of ethics and politics. A way of intimating to people, showing them how they should live their lives, but also showing government how it ought to rule. Confucius purposefully avoided matters of the afterlife and of the supernatural, distinguishing this practical philosophy from certain of the religions that we've looked at, and focuses instead very much on mankind's life on earth, insisting that everyone must follow their own Tao, or their own way. This is similar to the concept of Dharma that we saw in India. Depending upon your role in life, including even if you are the emperor or the king, you have a Tao or a way that you're supposed to follow. And this included performing your duties to family and to community, and having compassion and empathy for other people. This is a largely benevolent, communitarian, practical philosophy. Family is very important. The idea of filial piety is crucial in Chinese civilization. The idea that parents are to be respected and obeyed, and they are to be honored in death. And so too are the ancestors. The ancestors are considered still part of the family, to always be honored. And all family members were to subordinate their personal needs and wants to those of, or the wishes of, the patriarchal head of the family, the father. So what are the 5 relationships in Chinese Confucian filial piety? The son is subordinate to the father. The wife is subordinate to the husband. The younger brother is subordinate to the older brother. Everyone is subordinate to the king or the emperor. Son to father, wife to husband, brother to brother, and everyone to the king. And friend is always a friend to friend. Would be number 5. And a sort of inverse of what we call in the West the golden rule: do not do unto others that which you would not wish done to you. And always seek virtue, and always seek wisdom. Confucius also introduces the concept of meritocracy. Meritocracy. Ocracy is government, right? Like democracy, demos, the people, government by the people. Merit means you deserve it. Meritocracy would mean government by people who are the most effective at what they do. Staff your bureaucracy with people who know what they're doing, not with people who pay money to be there or kiss someone's ass or are sycophants or whatever. Place people in positions of authority because they are effective at their job. Meritocracy. And if everyone follows their Tao and does as they should, the result in Chinese civilization, says Confucius, it is a very important word, is harmony. The emperor, the dynasty, all people should always be striving and doing their part and following their Tao so that there would be harmony. And to connect this with our previous concept of the mandate of heaven, if that were the case, then the dynasty would continue to possess the mandate of heaven. But if certain people don't follow their Tao, follow the way, particularly those in the dynastic government, perhaps even the emperor himself, then harmony would collapse and they would lose the mandate of heaven. So it's a philosophy that is very much concerned with sort of the idea of the best that we could be as individuals and as a society, with ideas of like our concepts as honesty and kindness and righteousness. But there is another school of thought that emerges during this period and is associated with this gentleman bottom left, Han Fei, and his great work, the Han Fei Seed. Legalism takes a little bit different tack. Confucius's point of departure for his philosophy was that human beings are inherently good. That at their core, human beings are good people and that you could appeal to them to, as I said moments ago, be the best that they could be. And along with that, there was this idea that the universe had a moral core to it. Well, legalism rejects that idea and rejects the idea that human beings are inherently good, and instead takes the point of departure that human beings are inherently bad, evil even, corrupt, and that having a benevolent government that would sort of win over the hearts and minds of the people by following the Tao was not all that useful. And what you needed, though, was a government that was strict and heavy-handed. You needed a strong ruler to instill strict laws and very harsh punishments for those violations of those laws. You need a strong man. It didn't matter if people liked him. It didn't matter that he was benevolent or followed some sort of Tao of benevolence and honesty and justice. No, he needed to have strict laws to regulate bad people's behavior. And if people broke those laws, you needed to have punishments that were so harsh that you would certainly convince the vast majority of people to never break those laws. This is how you effectively run a government, says Han Fei. And as we go throughout Chinese history, some dynasties will be more influenced by one of these schools of thought than the other. And we're about to see one that's more influenced by the latter philosophy, legalism. For the Zhou dynasty begins to decline around 500, 400 BCE, begins to lose control over powerful principalities on the outside of the Chinese dynastic realm. And this, with the collapse eventually of the Zhou dynasty, begins in Chinese history the so-called Warring States period. from 476 to 221 BCE, the Warring States period, when there were, states at war for control over the kingdom, for supremacy. Emerging victorious eventually from this Warring States period is the state of Qin, whose ruler, Qin Shi Huangdi, declares himself to be the new emperor, declares to have taken up the mandate of heaven, and declares the advent of a new dynasty. And who ascribes, as I said a second ago, to the philosophy of legalism, and who rules rather ruthlessly, making legalism, in fact, the official ideology of the Qin state, outlawing all other philosophies, including Confucianism, to the point of even burning books that were deemed unacceptable. Going even farther than that, 460 Confucian scholars were executed by Qin Shi Huangdi. He's trying to eradicate other ideologies. While meanwhile centralizing rule, doing away with the old system of hereditary provincial governors and installing still officials that answered directly to the emperor, and who were placed there by the emperor, and who were looked over by a ministry of censors, officials directly connected with and under the control of the emperor, who would travel around the kingdom keeping tabs, more or less, on provincial rulers that had been placed there by Qin Shi Huangdi himself, making sure they were carrying out his mandates and dictates. These provincial and even below them district officials were at least appointed on merit. I said they did away with the hereditary positions, and they're placed there by the emperor based on merit, and could be removed if they weren't doing their job effectively. Qin Shi Huangdi, in doing this, was trying to break up an old clan system and to disrupt old clan and family loyalties, to in turn establish the primacy, the supremacy of the state and of himself by proxy. A very, as you might imagine with legalism, a very strict penal code was put in place with strict laws and very, very harsh and often violent punishments. He was an extremely ruthless ruler. There is a standardized system of weights and measurements put in place. Systematically installed the Chinese system of writing throughout the realms, a monetary system, internal improvements like building roads and canals, extended the empire all the way in the south to Vietnam, and constructed the first parts of the Great Wall in the north to keep out invading nomads. The most threatening of which were the Xiongnu that I mentioned earlier. First, nomadic, pastoral, horseback warrior people from sort of northeast Asia to threaten the sovereignty of China in the north. Certainly they are not the last, and you probably know about the Mongols I mentioned earlier. We'll get to them, but before there were the Mongols, it was the Xiongnu. And so elements of this Great Wall are built as other projects were, and including, as we saw in Egypt, with forced labor, and at the cost of many lives. A highly unpopular project was this. At the same time that the wall is being built, Qin Shi Huangdi was attempting to keep aristocrats of the empire in the capital so he could sort of watch over them. Something that, if you take my world too, it was process perfected in French history by the French king Louis XIV in the Palace of Versailles. You know, keep your friends close and your enemies closer is the concept. Give them what they want and entertain them, but make sure they're not plotting against you. He also begins the practice, does Chen Shi Huangdi, of using, having around him as a core of advisors, eunuchs, word which ought to be up there, E-U-N-U-C-H-S, eunuchs, which are men who have been castrated, removed of their vital male parts, and perhaps had at time been slaves, but being castrated as such would be a permanent reminder of a subordinate position and a sort of humiliation, but also, too, if we're talking about people who are at the court of an emperor or a king, and in a place in time where dynasties were hereditary, these are individuals who would not seemingly pose a threat to a hereditary dynasty, for they themselves cannot have their children. Just a practical consideration. At times in Chinese history, some of these eunuchs could be very, very powerful and influential. Any of you watch Game of Thrones? I don't even ask them. Or shit that I think is like current and modern and like young people would watch. It's like in my U.S. class, I was like, we're talking about colonial Virginia, and I'm going to start bringing a ruler and banging it and waking you up. Oh, you're not even asleep. Okay. And I was talking about Pocahontas, and I was like, yeah, you know, the Disney movie, that wasn't that long ago, right? And somebody looked it up right then and there on their phone. I was like, yeah, it was like 1995. Oh, okay, all right, well, I thought it wasn't that long ago, but anyway. My point was that in that film, in that series, in those books, one of the main characters who, as everyone else is dying season after season, he lives on and on and on. He is a eunuch. There's also a eunuch army that plays a large role in the show. Anyway, speaking of armies, Chen Shi Huangdi was obsessed with the notion that his enemies would get the better of him in the afterlife, and that his tomb needed to be protected by a vast army, which takes the form of thousands of soldiers made of terracotta. Which was lost to history for thousands of years, until it was stumbled upon by a farmer digging a well in 1974, 35 miles east of Xi'an. A massive army is uncovered of larger-than-life-size terracotta soldiers guarding the tomb of Chen Shi Huangdi that he thought would defend him from his enemies in the afterlife. 4 pits are discovered of more than 1,000 soldiers in each pit, along with chariots and horses and weapons. And if you look at these warriors, there is extreme detail in their faces. No two faces are alike. And the uniforms have incredible, elaborate detail. And these people, their faces and features represent the different ethnicities of the Chinese people in the empire. An absolutely incredible undertaking and achievement that was probably ruinously expensive. And took God knows how many months to complete, in the work of the best artisans that could be found, to the pleasing of the emperor. You'll watch a short documentary film on this, so I feel a little bit less bad about the fact that I can't Google Earth drop our little guy into where the terracotta soldiers are, because you will at least get to see it in the film. There were elaborate tales of the money that Qin Shi Huangdi had spent in sort of self-aggrandizement like this, like he had supposedly 700 palaces or something like that, which to historians were thought to be like apocryphal tales. Like it wasn't really true. These are exaggerations of a boastful man and people who look back on his sort of strongman legacy, and then this is discovered. And they're like, well, shit, maybe it is true. I mean, my God, imagine the time and money that were spent on this. And perhaps he did have 700 palaces. And if something like this could remain underground, hidden from all the world for thousands of years until some poor farmer stumbles upon it, then who knows what else is beneath the ground out there. There's a map of the reaches of the Qin Dynasty Great Wall in the north and in the west. And the specter of the Xiongnu looming outside of those walls. And there's a modern day picture of the Great Wall as it stands today. By that I mean that's the next slide, which I can see here, but you can't. Well, the Qin dynasty doesn't last much longer than the life of Qin Shi Huangdi himself, so perhaps he should have been more concerned with the long-term health of his dynasty than he was for his soul in the afterlife, or in self-aggrandizement during his own reign. For it's not long before that dynasty collapses and in its place emerges the Han dynasty. The first ruler of which is Hangao-Su, who opts to keep the centralized state structure that Qin Shi Huangdi had put in place. That is, a provincial and district system with meritocratic appointments as opposed to the old hereditary aristocratic system. But, and this is extremely important, they canned legalism and adopted Confucianism as the official ideology of the dynasty. So we have switched our school of thought here. That being said, they do maintain that ministry of censors, or that censorate branch of the government to sort of keep tabs on provincial and district officials. But they reversed the Qin policy of disrupting family loyalties and attempted to restore the family as the basic social unit. After Hangao-Su, the Emperor Han Wudi, who rules up to 87 BCE, is able to extend the reaches of the empire, as you saw on the maps before this, north into Manchuria and to Korea. He takes the fight, if you will, to the Xiongnu, going on the offensive in China's northern border regions. He develops an imperial cavalry so that you could take on those horseback warriors directly and sort of try to defeat them at their own game of horseback warfare. Paying for these improvements in your military with taxes on salt and iron and alcohol. Han Wudi also introduces something that's going to remain extremely important through Chinese history, and that is the civil service examination system. Introduced for staffing positions in the bureaucracy, establishing an academy for study for people who would then become, upon graduating, government officials. Now, initially, at its very earliest inception, this is only open to aristocratic candidates, but eventually it would become open to all males everywhere in the empire. And I I say all males, Chinese society, as you could have guessed earlier, is very patriarchal, even chauvinistic. And Confucianism, obviously, through the 5 relationships and filial piety, allows that. Speaking of Confucius, when we talk about studying, either at the academy or later, all throughout the realms, to take exams that will allow you to become a government official, what do you study for those exams? The Confucian classics, the collection of the great works and thoughts of Confucius. I mean, there are other practical things that you would study, like mathematics, but the core of your study would be the writings and teachings of Confucius. And young men would spend their entire adolescent lives studying these works. And they would take exams, and if they did well, could go on to a next level and a next level of exams. And at the end of the day, those who performed very well would get the highest positions in government. Even as head provincial officials or officials at court advising the emperor himself. Or you might get a job staffing the Great Wall, or even perhaps working on building projects like improving the Great Wall or working on canals and roads. More middling positions, you could be a tax collector or something, a customs official, if you will, in ports. A judge, perhaps, in the legal system. Maybe if you didn't perform all that well, you get like a very localized position. If you performed really poorly, you might not get any position at all. And somewhere on that spectrum, I mean, you could be a nobody who brings glory to your family and your village by getting a great position, or you could be from a family of wealth and influence who performed shitty and got a menial job and brought instead disgrace to your family and your people. Such was the system of Chinese meritocracy, which produces, by the way, in China, a class, if you will, of scholar officials. And when in some dynasties let it fall into disuse, and some are really robust about it, but when you do have the latter case, you have then the best and brightest minds in the entire empire all working for the government. And that's a really good way to run a government, when you have all of your best and brightest doing what they do best on behalf of the government through the bureaucracy. Now, in the long term, and we explore this in more detail in my world too, that might prove to be limiting because you're stifling creativity if you've got like your best genius minds working on canal and road projects or whatever. So. Less so important here in World I, but in the long term of Chinese history, the scholar official system can be somewhat of a limiting thing. In terms of economy, under the Han, the population expands dramatically from 20 million, the figure I threw out earlier, to perhaps 60 million. Though this leads to more people, same roughly amount of land, it leads to smaller family farms than had been the case. And taxes to pay for things like the army and the new cavalry and the wall and such could be a burden for peasant families, especially if there were bad harvests. And when this becomes a combo, when you have bad harvest combined with high taxes, you have rural revolt, peasant revolts. And remember, those are among the signs that a dynasty is losing the mandate of heaven. Under the Han, merchants were viewed quite dimly. And this is really throughout Chinese history, merchants are kind of looked down upon. Whereas in other parts of the world, they kind of occupy a more privileged position, particularly with the advent in the West of mercantilism, later capitalism. But merchants in China are viewed as parasites, and their activities are severely restricted or controlled by the government. Nonetheless, under the Han, under government control, trade expanded, roads expanded, canals were dug to connect rivers. Trade along the Silk Road expanded. The Chinese under the Han trade with as far away Rome in Europe. At the time of the early Roman Republic and what would become under the Han, then the Roman Empire in the West. Silk became a prized luxury item in the Roman Empire, and flowing back into China from Europe was silver. Communication and trade also increases with South Asia, and through those contacts coming back into China, not just physical goods and people, but Buddhism comes to China via interactions with South Asia. And Buddhism eventually spreads widely throughout the Chinese Han realms, though the government attempts to keep the lid on that. Remember, Confucianism is the official state-sponsored school of thought. Eventually, landed aristocratic families will begin to fill a sort of void of power when there is a series of inept rulers under the Han. This will be a theme no matter where we're looking. We have a series of inept or inadequate rulers. It leads to a period of decline. Rulers content to live the luxuries of palace life and not be concerned with what's going on outside the palace walls. Weak rulers could also become susceptible to being dominated by eunuchs at court and others. The Xiongnu are a constant problem on the northern frontier, despite the Great Wall. Some emperors opt to simply pay them ransom rather than to fight them, pay them not to pillage the towns and cities and farms of the north. And then eventually, professional armies that are recruited from non-Han Chinese peoples on the frontier are also unreliable. You have an army of people who are more or less outsiders to the Han. They're viewed as unreliable or not faithful. And all that to say, the last Han ruler is overthrown in a coup in 221. Similar to my closing thought in the India lecture last time, with the collapse of the Han, China will not see another great dynasty emerge for 400 years. We said that when Ashoka Maurya's dynasty collapses in India, such would be the case for South Asia as well. And to China we will return, but first, what day is it? Thursday. So Tuesday we'll come in and have a brief review. I won't have anything like a systematic review point by point, but you can ask questions. We can discuss the comparative essay and document readings. And the quiz will open immediately thereafter and stay open for a few days. And we'll go from there. And then when we reconvene on Thursday, we will hop over to Europe and we will talk about the Greek city-states, Minoan and Mycenaean civilization, Roman Republic, Roman Empire. And then there will be quiz too. When does this cohort return? Okay, so I don't see you Tuesday, but I do see you Thursday. Yeah. Okay, cool. All right. Question?